In my experience in dealing with British officials, they fall into I'll say 3 categories. The third is just the genuinely clueless. They're like their American counterparts. They recently came to a portfolio. They're newbies, and they can be forgiven. Whether or not they clue up, that's a different issue. But for those that do know the problem set, for them, I have nothing but contempt. Why? One group of people still harbors this Orientalist view of the Pakistan army back in the days of the Empire. And they have these very fond memories of these gentlemen at Sandhurst. And it's as if they're living in a diorama. And they're just museum pieces. And they are unable to reconcile the reality of the contemporary Pakistan army. And you know, I have a lot of regard. For example, Jahangir Khan was right here, one of the finest army chiefs, and one of the few that was committed to democracy, right? And he was railroaded by Nawaz Sharif. But for the vast majority, this is not a professional army. And I don't need to go into polemics. I can simply make the point that professional armies don't wage coups. Professional armies do not run countries behind the scenes. They do not elect prime ministers as they did with Taliban Khan. By the way, he is the mayor of Islamabad. He has no portfolio. His remit does not extend to Rawalpindi. So those folks are inured to evidence. They suffer classically, I would say, from confirmation bias. Right? They only want to hear things that comport with their vision. But then there's I would say, another more nefarious group of people. They fully understand what Pakistan's ISI does, not only in Afghanistan, but also with respect to India. But they value, bluntly speaking, ISI surveillance of British Pakistanis who go back to the UK. I would argue that for those, this is the most important thing that they get from Pakistan. And I think that the height of cynicism in this trade-off was when the British soldiers were in Helmand, right? The Brits said nothing, even though we knew full well who was behind a lot of the Taliban activities. So I can't tell you what piece of evidence can you present to people when they are selectively weeding out evidence for either political reasons or other reasons. And it's like, you know, taking a leak in the ocean, expecting the level to rise. So I wish you good luck. But going to your point, I'm as critical as they come on Pakistan. But one of the things that I find very vexing is that Afghans, much like Indians, like to exogenize all of their problems and place it at Pakistan. I'm going to give you a historical fact. The Pakistanis tried for decades to foment insurgency in Kashmir. They literally did this from 47. They did not succeed until the late 1980s, when actually beginning with Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, she really kind of hijacked democracy, and she used a very authoritarian means to dismiss a bunch of elected governments in states that were not aligned to the Congress. It was only when India completely screwed up Kashmir that the environment became conducive for Pakistani malfeasance. Now, if you look at the history and the literature on insurgency, sir, it is true that the most recalcitrant and difficult to defeat insurgencies are those that have outside support. However, the corruption, the failure of governance, all of these things you cannot blame on Pakistan. And Gandhi in particular, I mean, he made quite a bit of money running an organization alleging that he knew how to fix failed states. And he's been there for a while, don't see a lot of fixing. So I would encourage my Afghan friends to, while we all work to hold Pakistan accountable, and we can agree to disagree on some of the empirics. I agree that Pakistan has sanctuary, whether they have positive versus negative control, we can debate. But what we can't debate is that this is really a two-part problem. You have an external support for these insurgents, and you have a very conducive environment in Afghanistan. And also Afghanistan has chosen policies that do not help their relationship. The Afghan position on the Durand Line, for example, has no support in international law. And Afghanistan also has to take responsibility for some of the things that it has done in Pakistan's history. And everyone knows me, I'm a critic of Pakistan. But I would argue that different Afghan leaders, Dawood, for example, deliberately chose policies that were antagonistic in periods of time that were fairly injurious. So if you really want to fix this, and I'm not even sure what fixing or what the reference to this is, you're not going to have stability in Afghanistan if you're solely looking to exogenize the sources of your problems. It's coming internally and externally, and you can't ignore the internal sources of instability. And I say that as a friend.
Great. So one more round, and I'd like to take this gentleman who's been waiting, the gentleman, our friend from the Indian High Commission, and can we have a lady? We've only had one lady. I would welcome a lady.
I think someone from this side. Suppose I don't mind.
Yes, excellent. Thank you.
Where the stop fails, overlooking others.
Oh, I apologize. We're in this corner.
Thank you very much. Nick Ahmadja from Afghanistan Embassy here in London. I would like to congratulate the panelists for your excellent and informative presentation today. Just a very short objection on the slides that have been shown at the beginning of the presentation by you, Dr. Fair, especially the left-hand side, which showed 41% employed by Taliban. We have to, as an Afghan, I have to tell you that we have to differentiate between control and patrol. Because Taliban definitely conduct patrols in those areas, but not control. Control means that you run the government.
You misread the graph. You misread the graph. It had contests and control.
Yeah. Well,
and those were not my graphs. This is
yeah.
from the
Yeah, I know that it's mentioned in your presentation. So control means that you run the government offices or you run schools, hospitals. It's not the case. Actually, I cannot deny that the Taliban are conducting their spectacular attacks in different cities and places in Afghanistan, but we are very proud of our Afghan National Defense and Security Forces independently dealing with them. Thank you very much.
I'll be extremely short. Thank you very much for the lovely discussion. My question is, when you mention friendly forces to leave, what do you define them as? Like, sorry, beg your pardon, foreign forces to leave. Does that include forces from Rawalpindi as well? Thank you.
Very nice, concise question.
Maybe I can have a small one.
Thank you. We have been group for World City Congress. Historically, we touched upon that question already, but I think we need to really look at the root cause of this whole issue. And so I do understand that the Afghanistan issue is more sort of a civil or internal to some extent. But what about Pakistan's role in terms of marginalizing their own people, like Sindhi and Baloch and the Khartoum? So it's not only external, but the whole destabilization in this region is their own internal role as well, and how it affects Afghanistan and neighboring countries.
Is it a very short question?
It's about democracy.
All right, if it's short,
Very short.
If it's short.
The bigger problem, the bigger challenge in Afghanistan is the political constructs of representation. We're just in the wrong place for the last 18 years. In the last presidential election, around more than 6 million Afghans voted. Whether it was a big fraudulent election or not, for the first time there was a peaceful transition of power in Afghanistan. This is what Afghans need. We need to invest in institutional capacity. If we have a weak government which is growing or developing, we will undermine the insurgency. Otherwise, the insurgency is undermining us. And it's a very simple, I think it's a very simple equation. We have to invest in democracy. Neither the West nor the Taliban understand democracy. I think Islam is very comfortable with democracy. Yeah.
So you all have about 2 minutes each to not only answer a question of your choice, but also to make somewhat of a summarizing type of approach towards the day's activities. Should we start with Christine and go the other way of that? So 2 minutes, please.
So obviously your question is really, it's perspicacious. Pakistan's problems with itself and with its region, I would argue, began before partition. And the two-nation theory was fundamentally a communalizing and othering discourse. It, from the beginning, alienated about 1 in 4 of its citizens who were not Muslims. Its second sin, if you will, was the objectives resolution, which basically created a permanent job for mullahs to decide who is or is not the right Muslim. And the army, not with Zia, but actually beginning with Ayub, was very clear that the way that Pakistan would survive was by embracing this ideology. And it did everything it could to, Ayub, for example, align the textbooks with this ideology. And of course, because it has a neighbor that it can't defeat militarily with an army, and as Pakistan developed nuclear weapons, we know that by '84 they had a crude device and possibly earlier. The tool that became the preferred tool of prosecuting Pakistan's foreign policy objectives was really using mujahideen, terrorists, whatever we're going to call them. So I think you're right in identifying these different ethnic groups. But I would argue the reason why they adopted Islam was because of some of the very first crimes of Jinnah. He himself was not a democrat. He wasn't a Democrat. He made himself the first viceroy. And if you look at the 1946 elections and who voted to join Pakistan, you'll see that many people in the West didn't have a chance to vote, and those who did vote did not want to join. And fearing that, this is why Jinnah took a very different approach from Nehru, who used democratization, federalization. He wanted to be Islamic State. And he was really the first person to cynically use Islam to get people to subordinate their ethnicities. And then, of course, he didn't live very long. The military and the bureaucracy took this up. So I think you're right. This is, many of Pakistan's problems with itself and its neighbors really comes to some of these very early decisions about statehood. And I would recommend Hussein Haqqani's recent book. He kind of lays out Pakistan needs a new narrative for itself if it's going to be at peace with itself and its neighborhood. And the problem with that is, A, it's Hussein Haqqani who wrote it, no one's going to take that seriously. But I think he's right. Even though he might not be the best messenger for that message, I think his message is spot on.
Well, the foreign forces, and according when I talk about foreign forces, the implication is Western military forces. Generally speaking, I don't think the Taliban particularly like having anybody around, whether it's Pakistanis, the Iranians, or whatever. But in terms of the decision whether we can work or the issue they raise is that the foreign forces. So of course the implication is, or the question I suppose, is if the foreign forces leave, that magnifies the influence, the power, the division of power can exercise over Afghanistan, because suddenly the Afghan government becomes weaker relative to that, which I think is true, and that's why probably the intent of the Afghan government is to face any American withdrawal they can as much as possible. So, dilute that over a number of years. The point that arose in the past months is that it's not clear what President Trump will do. So whatever the Afghan government wants to do or hope to do, the problem that has no control, of course, what President Trump might decide any day. And therefore, that's the sense of urgency that, of course, is now understood, well understood throughout the region, is well understood to the Taliban too. So the Afghan government is already in a position of relative weakness, because everybody needs to understand that America committed to Afghanistan is wavering. And that already reduces the stock prices of the Afghan government. So basically, and the more you wait, I think, the more is likely. And any day there could be some hint, even not a decision, but just some hint from President Trump that he's thinking about that. And then immediately you see the stock value of Afghan actions going, diving until the point where he makes an announcement. The moment he makes an announcement, even if he says, we'll leave in a year's time, it's already the end, because basically the stock value of Afghan action will be zero at that point. So basically, if you wait until the point Trump makes an announcement, your negotiating power is zero. So that's why I think Afghan options are running out. That's the reality. And it's also the fault of the Afghan government to see each other because they wasted their time. They're 15 years, not there 1 month, 15 years to come with something more solid, and it's not there. So I think now the onus is on any Afghan government, the current one, the one we have next year, whether it's the same or not, to actually come up with some kind of interesting offer, whatever offer is around there, so that that's the easy at this point. I think the perfect solution is no longer available. I'm sorry, but wasting time in politics is a crime. So that's the situation where I think we are now.
I think I would just say to repeat that there are certain basic realities that cannot be changed by any policy, by any country, no matter how powerful it thinks it is or how powerful others think it is. One of them is Afghanistan is a landlocked country that doesn't have very much water. And that means that Afghanistan is dependent on its neighbors for its economy. The second thing is Afghanistan, I don't know how many people know this, is the poorest country in the entire world outside of sub-Saharan Africa. And it is poorer than most of the countries of sub-Saharan Africa. And you have to take that into account when you're talking about what Afghanistan should be. Why is Afghanistan not a real democracy? I don't know, is the United States a real democracy? Right now, I don't know. Look, and no one knows how many people live in Afghanistan. Nobody knows where they live. Nobody knows who they are. They don't have addresses. They don't have first names and last names. I'm not criticizing them. I'm just saying the state is very, very weak. And maybe the states don't become strong through nice processes of technical assistance. They become strong through ugly political and military processes. And if Afghanistan gets a stronger state, that's how it would happen. And where will the resources come from? They will have to come from outside. So if you be careful what you wish for. Then whether you hate your neighbors or blame them or all, Afghanistan's a landlocked country. Its neighbors are not going to change. They're not going anywhere. Nobody is going to invade those neighbors and make them disappear at the cost of tens of millions of lives or whatever. The United States is far away. The belief and hope that many Afghans had that because of their relationship with the United States after 9/11, they would not have to deal with what they perceive as their neighbors' malign interest is, I'm afraid, a misplaced hope. It's based on a misunderstanding of Afghanistan and its neighbors, and for most of all, it is based on a misunderstanding of the United States. And speaking as an American, I can tell you, you should not be relying on the United States for the future security of Afghanistan. You will have to live with your neighbors. That's the reality. And the sooner Afghanistan figures out how to do that. What I told them when I was in government is the United States cannot enable Afghanistan to avoid making deals with its neighbors. What the United States can do during the period that it is involved is help Afghanistan make better deals with its neighbors. That's what we should be aiming for.
Okay, let me try and sum up. I do wish to kind of just briefly respond. If I'd been allowed to continue, when I say increasingly civil, I mean because since departure, military transition in 2014, I simultaneously see the Afghan conflict as not only a civil conflict, but a proxy war, a regional conflict, and a drugs war. It operates on many different levels. So there was no way trying to undermine that. And I think that brings me back to the kind of final point in terms of what is a legitimate Afghan state. I think the points about democracy are really interesting. When I worked for the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit, we did research into elections, and we said, what does a system that you would like to live in look like to you? And when Afghans across the country described a system, it was essentially in line with our sort of, albeit idealized, vision of what a democratic system is. Whether or not the current process the electoral process coming up, 2018, 2019, is going to lead there. I'm not sure. You know, did we rush into the electoral process, putting in place systems and institutions rather than actually trying to change norms and traditions? You know, time will tell. But I do think that, broadly speaking, Afghans themselves should be able to define the system that most represents them.
Can we, before we greet our final speaker who's going to close off today's session, the Democracy Forum Chair Barry Gardner, Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade, let's put our hands together to thank our panelists for Sir, the floor is yours.
I'm a man, I can't chew gum and walk and talk at the same time, so I'm sure I can't possibly hold this. If I just speak like this, is that all right? Yes. Fine. Okay. Look, it's been a really heavy session. So I thought I'd give you a bit of light entertainment at the beginning. Okay? And it came from the Asian Affairs magazine, September edition. And it said, if Russia, Pakistan, Iran, and the United States could unite in a common goal of stamping out terrorism, the prospect of peace in Afghanistan would improve. Well, I just thought, hey, they forgot Santa Claus in that. We started off this afternoon with Lord Bruce, who took us back to 1892, a time when India was putting that line of control between itself and Afghanistan, that buffer area. And there is nobody living, well actually there's one person there, because your father is still alive. He's 94. Yeah, he's not yet. But his great-grandfather, of course, the 9th Earl of Elgin, was actually 2 years later the Viceroy of India. So the family knew all about it, right? Now, if you scratch history, you find geography. And it seems to me that that is what today has been very powerfully telling us. That the historical problems, the tragic loss of life, the conflicts that have embroiled not just people within Afghanistan, but its neighbors and the United Kingdom, the United States. What we've heard today is that fundamentally, geography is at the core of those problems. And Barnett, you said about the country has never produced enough resources to sustain its function as a state. We went on from there to Christine talking about it was just a wonderful set of humorous anecdotes and tropes, which I will steal shamelessly, I'm sure, at some stage. But about protecting Chabahar from Trump. But all about the capacity of a country to sustain itself and to develop the infrastructure to utilize the geographic resources that it actually has, but cannot benefit from because of its landlocked nature. I have to say, the only optimist on our panel, Antonio, I'm looking at you, was actually a deep pessimist. Because he said, yeah, there is a solution to all of this, but my God, it doesn't look very appealing. And what it is it's the way in which China and CPAC is colonizing, I think you said CPAC is colonizing Pakistan to enrich China. Was that Christine that said that? Sorry, that was Christine that said that. But you extensively talked about the finance from China as the potential way in unlocking, and I didn't get the message that it was unlocking a peace. I got the message that it was creating a situation where there was less conflict. And I do think we have to distinguish between those two things. Because peace is not simply an absence of conflict. And that's where I felt your optimism was deeply pessimistic. Because the best scenario that I think you envisaged was one where, yes, there was either a diminution or an absence of conflict if enough money flowed through. But what we didn't get was a sense of how peace can actually be brought about. And I think I'm right in saying that I didn't get it down here, Emily, but I think you talked about the role of women in politics. Nobody seemed to talk about it. And our need to talk about what peace would look like in Afghanistan is something that I felt we were light on today. And at the end, Christine talked about, when she spoke about the origins of Pakistan, she spoke about, I suppose, really, the problems. It's a very good lesson for us, I think, the problems of identity politics and what that can lead to. That she was talking about at a state level, but identity politics can bring with it a real sense of conflict that is incompatible with a genuine peace. So ultimately we talked about resources coming from outside. And that being a way to live with your neighbors. Again, I think Dr. Rubin said about the importance of you've got to live with your neighbors. Well, go back to Aristotle. And Aristotle's politics, the fundamental question of politics is, how do we live with each other? How can we form a relationship that enables each of us to gain some sense of self-respect, some sense of dignity, some sense of the value of our community and of our integrity in a way that is not destructive of the very same things for other people. And so today it seems to me we did talk a lot about history. We did talk about geography. We talked about the need for releasing resources. But we're left with the title of this debate, Afghanistan, the challenges ahead. The challenge is very simple. How do we live together?